You know that feeling, maybe just a little niggle in the back of your mind when you think about the fact that, well, this isn't going to last forever.
Mm,
For many of us, those thoughts can bring on a pretty hefty dose of anxiety.
definitely.
So in this deep dive, we're going straight to the heart of what's often called death anxiety, or if you want the more technical term, thanatophobia.
Thanatophobia, exactly.
Uh,
And we've pulled together a really interesting set of sources to explore this very universal human experience.
Right. And we're looking specifically at the anxiety triggered by our own mortality. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not other stuff.
Exactly. It's important right off the bat to differentiate this from, say, necrophobia, which is more a fear of dead bodies or things associated with death.
Okay.
What we're focusing on is that deeper unease about our own eventual end.
And it's something that touches almost everyone, wouldn't you say, across all cultures, though I imagine it manifests in some pretty different ways depending on where you are.
Oh, absolutely. That's a key point. We're going to try and understand where this anxiety comes from, the different forms it can take, how researchers even attempt to measure something so personal.
Which sounds tricky.
It is. And maybe most importantly, how we as individuals and as societies try to cope with this fundamental truth of being human.
So the mission here is basically to extract the core insights, right? Give you, the listener, a much clearer picture of death anxiety without hopefully overwhelming you.
That's the plan.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly is death anxiety?
Well, as we've sort of touched on, it's the anxiety that arises from thinking about one's own death, the natophobia, as it's also known.
Right.
And this isn't just, a passing worry. It can really have a significant impact on various aspects of a person's life.
And just to be super clear again, not the same as being afraid of dead things.
Not the same as necrophobia, no. What's quite striking is how widespread death anxiety is. Studies indicate it affects all sorts of people, men and women, those who are married, those who aren't. It really cuts across demographic lines.
And it's not just a Western concept, is it? I mean, it feels pretty universal.
Not at all. Sociological and psychological research confirms that it's a universal phenomenon found across cultures. However, and this is important, the specific ways these anxieties present themselves, the particular fears and concerns individuals have, can differ quite a bit depending on their cultural background.
Makes sense.
We also see, perhaps unsurprisingly, a higher prevalence of death anxiety in individuals who are facing terminal illnesses, like advanced cancer, where the reality of death becomes much more immediate and unavoidable.
That makes perfect sense. And it sounds like death anxiety isn't always an isolated issue either. It can connect to other things.
That's a really important point. Researchers have found connections between death anxiety and a number of mental health conditions. It can often act as a kind of underlying fear that contributes to disorders like general anxiety, for example.
So it fuels other anxiety sometimes.
It can, yeah. The good news is that there are therapeutic approaches that can be effective, things like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, meaning centered therapies, and mindfulness-based approaches are some of the methods used to help people manage death anxiety.
Okay, so we're getting a good handle on what death anxiety is. Now, our sources point to the idea that there are different kinds of this anxiety. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, the psychotherapist Robert Langs proposed a really helpful framework. He suggested three primary causes or types:
Yep.
predatory, predator, and existential death anxiety.
Okay.
Let's start with predatory death anxiety.
Predatory. That sounds a bit primal.
It is. It's essentially the fear of being harmed,
Right.
and it's considered the most ancient and, well, fundamental form. Think about it from an evolutionary perspective, even down to single-celled organisms. They have mechanisms to detect danger and react to threats to ensure their survival.
Right. Basic survival instinct.
Exactly. This basic instinct, this fear of being attacked or injured, is at the core of predatory death anxiety. When this type of anxiety is activated in humans, it triggers our adaptive responses, leading to that well-known fight-or-flight reaction, either confronting the threat or trying to escape it.
So that's about being the potential victim. What about predator death anxiety? That sounds like the flip side.
It kind of is. This arises when an individual is the one inflicting harm on another, whether that's physical or emotional harm.
Ah.
What's fascinating here, according to Langs, drawing on some Freudian ideas, is the role of unconscious guilt. He suggests that this sense of guilt is almost built into us, maybe from our evolutionary past, religious teachings, personal ethics.
So even if you don't feel guilty consciously?
Right. Even if someone isn't consciously aware of feeling guilty for their actions, this repressed feeling can still create a sense of unease and, in turn, motivate certain self-directed behaviors or decisions as a way to deal with that underlying guilt.
Huh. It's like a subconscious need to balance the scales somehow, or maybe punish oneself.
That's a good way to think about it, yeah. Now, the third type, existential death anxiety, is often considered the most potent form.
Existential.
Sure.
Okay, that sounds like we're getting into the deeper philosophical questions now.
We are. It stems from the fundamental understanding, the basic knowledge that our lives as human beings must eventually come to an end.
Just the fact of it.
Just the fact of it. Our capacity for language, our self-awareness, knowing that we are distinct individuals, and our ability to contemplate the future, to anticipate, all of that contributes to this type of anxiety.
Like Irvin Yalom said, didn't he? Something about existence being shadowed by death.
Exactly. He put it beautifully. Our existence is constantly shadowed by the knowledge that we will grow, blossom, and inevitably diminish and die.
Wow. It's a pretty stark reality when you really sit with that thought.
Absolutely. Humans are, as far as we know, unique in our awareness of our own mortality and the sheer amount of time we spend pondering the meaning of life and, consequently, death.
When did that awareness even kick in, evolutionarily speaking?
Well, some research suggests this kind of self-awareness emerged relatively recently in our evolutionary history, perhaps around 150,000 years ago. It's a guess, but an informed one.
And how have we primarily dealt with this profound awareness ever since?
According to Langs and many others, primarily through denial.
Denial. That seems like a rather basic way to cope with such a fundamental issue. Almost too simple.
It is, but it manifests in a surprisingly wide range of ways, many of which we might not even recognize as being rooted in a fear of death.
Like what?
Well, while a limited amount of denial can be helpful, just to function day to day, excessive and prolonged denial can be emotionally very costly. Our sources suggest that actions like breaking rules, engaging in manic celebrations, even acts of violence, or the relentless pursuit of wealth and power.
Really? Those things.
Sometimes, yes. They can be rooted in this unconscious denial of our mortality, often triggered perhaps by a significant experience related to death, like losing someone.
So it's not always negative, the outcome.
Well, the sources suggest that while these actions might occasionally lead to something positive, more often they can be quite damaging, both to ourselves and those around us. So this constant, often unconscious denial isn't just about avoiding the thought of death. It actually shapes our values, our pursuit of status, even our interpersonal relationships as we try to build a sense of lasting significance or, legacy.
It's a powerful underlying force in so much of what we do then.
It's a very powerful force.
Okay, that's a really powerful idea. So how do psychologists even begin to measure something as internal and, well, complex as death anxiety? It seems so subjective.
It's certainly a challenge, but researchers have developed various methods over the years. Back in 1972, Katenbaum and Einsberg laid some of the initial groundwork for this.
Okay.
Since then, we've seen the use of imagery tasks, where individuals might be asked to visualize death-related scenarios.
Right.
Straightforward questionnaires where people rate their levels of fear and anxiety.
Makes sense.
And even what are called apperception tests, like the Stroop test. You know the Stroop test, where the word blue is written in red ink.
Yeah, messes with your brain.
Exactly. So imagine if the word death pops up and your brain takes longer to process the color it's written in compared to a neutral word like chair. That suggests an underlying emotional charge associated with death that's grabbing your attention.
Ah, interesting. Like a subconscious reaction time thing.
Precisely. In this context, it can help researchers distinguish between death anxiety and something like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, by looking at how quickly people react to death-related words versus trauma-related words, for instance.
So it's about tapping into those subtle underlying emotional responses.
Exactly. And probably one of the most widely used tools for measuring death anxiety specifically is the Death Anxiety Scale, or DASS. We mentioned it earlier. It was created by Templer back in 1970.
The DASS.
It's a self-report questionnaire, just 15 true or false questions, specifically designed to assess an individual's fear and anxiety related to death.
15 questions seems quite concise for such a big topic.
It is, but it was a really important step in providing a standardized way to understand and study death anxiety. It's been used a lot in both clinical settings and research.
But it's not without its limitations, is it?
Yeah.
I mean, culture must play a huge role here.
That's absolutely right. The DOS was developed within a Western cultural framework, right? So its underlying assumptions about what death anxiety is and how it manifests might not perfectly align with experiences in all cultures.
Good point.
Researchers caution that its cultural sensitivity and how well its findings can be applied to diverse populations, its generalizability, need to be carefully considered when interpreting results.
So take the scores with a grain of salt, depending on the context.
Pretty much. In fact, a review that looked at over 20 different self-report measures of death anxiety found that many of them actually have some problematic psychometric properties,
Mining.
meaning they might not be measuring exactly what they intend to measure or doing it in a consistently reliable way across different people or times.
Wow, that really highlights just how complex it is to study something so deeply personal and, yeah, shaped by cultural beliefs.
Yeah.
Now, let's shift gears a bit. What are some of the factors that seem to influence how much death anxiety someone experiences? Our sources point to things like sex and age.
Yes, the connection between death anxiety and sex has been looked at quite a bit. The general trend appears to be that women tend to report higher levels of death anxiety compared to men,
Consistently.
pretty consistently in many studies. For example, a 1984 study by Thorson and Powell, which used both the DAS and another scale called a Collette-Lester Fear of Death Scale, found significantly higher average scores for women across different age groups.
Interesting. Why might that be the case? Any theories?
Well, researchers believe that factors like age and culture likely play a significant role in these observed differences. It's not just about being male or female in a vacuum.
Right.
One interesting theory suggests that mothers might experience greater death anxiety due to their traditional caregiving roles within families. This role often emphasizes their importance to live for the well-being of their children.
So a sense of responsibility making mortality feel more threatening.
Potentially, yeah. That concern for dependence could heighten concerns about their own mortality. It's also worth noting that while we intellectually understand death is inevitable, many people still struggle to truly accept their own mortality. Denial, as we discussed, can also play a role, maybe manifesting differently between sexes.
Okay. And what about the interplay of age and sex? Does it change over a lifetime?
It seems to. Studies using that Collette-Lester Fear of Death scale have looked at how death anxiety changes across the lifespan for both men and women. And interestingly, these studies suggest that death anxiety tends to peak for both sexes in their 20s.
In their 20s, not later in life. That's surprising.
It is a bit counterintuitive, isn't it? After that peak in the 20s, the patterns seem to diverge somewhat. While both men and women may experience a decline in death concerns as they age, there's some evidence of a potential second increase in death anxiety, specifically for women, maybe in their early 50s.
Huh. Any idea why? Menopause. Empty nest.
The studies don't always pinpoint a single cause, but those are definitely periods of significant life transition that could play a role. However, the general trend, regardless of sex, is that once individuals reach their 60s, death anxiety levels generally tend to decrease and stabilize at a lower level.
So it's definitely not a straightforward increase with age. It kind of mellows out later on.
Exactly. It's not a linear increase, which might be what some people assume.
So what do older people worry about then, if not death itself as much?
Well, research indicates that older individuals often worry less about the afterlife, perhaps, and more about the process of dying.
Ah, the practicalities.
Yeah, concerns related to their health declining, losing independence, their sense of self-worth, maybe being a burden, that kind of thing.
Okay.
It was also found that older women, in particular, tend to be more concerned about the loved ones they might leave behind than about their own death per se.
That connects back to the caregiver idea, maybe.
It could, yeah. And there was a study focusing on black and white individuals over 65, which suggested that age itself was a more significant predictor of death anxiety than either race or sex, especially for the women in that study.
Interesting.
The researchers also floated the idea that maybe differing communication styles about death between men and women might contribute to some of the observed variations in anxiety levels.
There's definitely a lot of complexity there. It seems our individual relationship with the idea of death is also a really key factor, right? The personal meaning we attach to it.
Absolutely. Individuals develop their own personal meanings associated with death, and these meanings can be either positive or negative, triggering a whole range of emotional responses.
Can you give an example of a positive meaning?
Sure. Someone might find comfort in the idea of their legacy, like the rippling effect they leave on others after they're gone, their impact on family, community, work. That can be a very comforting, positive meaning.
Okay. And negative ones.
Well, negative meanings, like seeing death as utter annihilation or eternal punishment, can obviously lead to significant emotional distress and turmoil.
Right.
What's crucial is that these meanings are highly individual, shaped by life experiences, beliefs, culture. Therapists, often using what's called a phenomenological approach, really trying to understand the individual's lived experience, can help people explore and understand their personal perspectives on death and potentially reframe negative meanings in a healthier, less distressing way.
So it's about really understanding that individual experience, not just applying a general theory.
Got it. Now, we've touched on Freud's ideas earlier, but what other psychological theories help us understand death anxiety?
Well, beyond Freud's initial hypothesis, which was basically that fear of death might actually be a disguise for deeper anxieties, maybe from childhood,
Yeah.
and his idea that our unconscious doesn't truly grasp our own death.
Which is a fascinating idea in itself.
It is. Beyond that, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross introduced her very well-known 5 stages of dying:
Hmm.
denial, anger or resentment, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. The DEB-D model.
Exactly. While these stages are often discussed in the context of someone facing their own terminal illness or grieving another's death, they also shed light on the emotional responses connected to death anxiety more broadly. Those feelings can surface even when death isn't imminent.
And Erickson's developmental theory also plays a role here, doesn't it? Later life stages.
Yes, absolutely. Erickson proposed that in the later stages of life, individuals face a psychosocial crisis of what he called ego integrity versus despair.
Ego integrity, meaning.
Ego integrity is about coming to terms with your life, looking back and accepting it, both the good and the bad, finding a sense of meaning and purpose in your life's journey, and therefore being able to accept your eventual death more peacefully.
And despair is the opposite.
Right. Despair arises if someone looks back and sees their life as full of missed opportunities, regrets, wrong turns, leading to feelings of bitterness, unfulfillment, and a greater fear of death because life feels incomplete or wasted.
So the theory suggests that achieving ego integrity leads to less death anxiety.
That's the idea. And a 2020 study provided some support for this. It found that when people felt their basic psychological needs for autonomy, relatedness, competence were being met, they reported higher levels of ego integrity and a greater acceptance of death.
And the reverse.
Conversely, unmet needs were linked to more despair and higher death anxiety.
That makes intuitive sense. Feeling a sense of fulfillment, connection, and control might make the idea of ending less frightening. What about Paul Wong's meaning management theory? That sounds really relevant to this.
It is indeed. Wong's meaning management theory, or MMT, suggests that our reactions to death are complex and, importantly, dynamic. They change over time and depending on the situation.
Okay.
His death attitude profile identifies different ways people accept death, ranging from a sort of neutral, matter-of-fact stance to approaching it with a sense of peace or spiritual readiness, and even seeing it as an escape from unbearable suffering.
So different kinds of acceptance.
Right. And MMT also delves into the various meanings we associate with death, which can significantly fuel our anxiety. He proposes 10 such meanings. Things like finality, the uncertainty of what happens, annihilation or ceasing to exist, the ultimate loss of everything, the disruption of life's flow, leaving loved ones behind, the potential for pain and loneliness, dying prematurely or violently, failing to complete one's life work, and even concerns about judgment or retribution after death.
Wow, that's a comprehensive list of potential fears.
It really covers a lot of ground, doesn't it? It shows how multifaceted our view of death can be.
Absolutely. So it's a very complex view of how we think about death. What else does MMT propose?
Well, MMT also considers our fundamental needs as what Wong calls biopsychosocial spiritual beings. We have this deep-seated desire not just for survival, but for connection, meaning, and even transcendence.
Transcendence.
Yeah.
Going beyond the self.
Yeah, connecting to something larger than oneself. And our spiritual beliefs, whatever form they take, can often play a significant role in buffering against death anxiety and fostering acceptance. The theory emphasizes that we actively construct meaning and purpose in our lives. It's not just given to us. We do it through questioning, imagination, the stories we tell, the symbols we use.
So meaning making is key.
Crucial. Having a strong sense of belonging, purpose, and meaning can act as a powerful shield against the anxiety of death, giving us a sense of personal control and independence, even in the face of something ultimately uncontrollable.
And it's not just about trying to avoid death, is it? MMT talks about other motivations too.
No, it's not just avoidance. MMT suggests we have two core motivations: To survive, of course, but also to find meaning in our survival. Even when faced with suffering, we have this innate drive to seek reasons to live, to find
Like
purpose.
Viktor Frankl's ideas.
Very much aligned with Frankl, yes. Embracing uncertainty, as Irvin Yalom also points out, is key here. Meaning can be found even in the face of challenges, and overcoming those challenges can lead to personal growth and even self-transcendence. MMT even reframes guilt sometimes as a potential catalyst for growth rather than just something negative.
Interesting.
The theory also highlights the interplay between our desire to avoid threats, like death, and our drive to seek rewards or achieve goals, suggesting that the fear of failure, for example, can actually fuel our motivation to succeed.
So anxiety isn't always paralyzing.
No, necessarily. Ultimately, MMT posits that a strong motivation to live well, to find meaning and purpose, goes hand in hand with the desire to avoid death, but it gives us something positive to focus on.
That's a really comprehensive way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Now, shifting to philosophy, how have thinkers approached the concept of death anxiety? We mentioned Heidegger briefly.
Right. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger viewed death as the one absolute certainty we all face. It will happen. Yet its timing is entirely indeterminate, unpredictable.
The when is unknown.
Exactly. This inherent uncertainty, according to Heidegger, creates a state of angst, a kind of fundamental existential anxiety about our being, our existence in the face of non-existence.
Sounds bleak.
It can sound that way. But Heidegger also believed that confronting this angst, ceasing to deny our mortality, what he famously called being for death, could actually lead to a deeper understanding of our existence and a sense of authentic freedom, living more fully because you accept the end.
So, facing the fear head-on, embracing the finitude, leads to freedom.
Precisely. That's the core idea.
Mm.
However, not everyone agreed. The American philosopher Sidney Hook offered a contrasting perspective.
What did Hooke argue?
Hook argued that simply being aware of the possibility of death doesn't necessarily lead to anxiety unless that possibility feels imminent or somehow concrete. He pointed out quite practically that many individuals throughout history have faced death without significant anxiety, sometimes even seeing it as a preferable alternative to certain life circumstances, like extreme suffering or dishonor.
That's an interesting counterpoint. It's not automatically terrifying for everyone in every situation. What about other existential philosophers like Rollo May or Viktor Frankl?
They also saw the awareness of our mortality as absolutely central to the human experience, shaping our personality and choices. Rollo May theorized that we constantly grapple with this tension between seeking meaning in life and facing the inevitable reality of death.
A fundamental conflict.
Yes. And this tension, May believed, could lead to either a negative, paralyzing anxiety that hinders us from living fully, or a positive, constructive anxiety that actually motivates us to live more authentically and seek deeper meaning.
And Frankl. We mentioned his connection to MMT.
Right. Viktor Frankl, with his logotherapy, also emphasized the crucial role of finding meaning, particularly meaning found through suffering or in the face of unavoidable limits like death. Finding that meaning is a powerful way to cope with the existential realities of life.
So meaning is the antidote, in a way. Are there other psychological approaches that have emerged more recently that touch on this?
Yes, one interesting one is regret theory, developed by researchers like Tomer and Eliasson.
Regret theory. How does that relate?
It focuses on how we evaluate our lives, particularly as we perceive ourselves getting closer to the end. The theory suggests that the possibility of death increases our anxiety primarily if we feel we haven't accomplished what we wanted, or if we feel we haven't lived a life that aligns with our core values, basically, if we anticipate having major regrets.
So it links death anxiety to life satisfaction or dissatisfaction.
Exactly. It highlights how our sense of fulfillment and purpose, or lack thereof, can directly influence our experience of death anxiety. So yes, psychology gives us one lens, but philosophers have also grappled with this for centuries, offering some really profound perspectives.
It seems our internal psychological landscape is so deeply intertwined with how we perceive death. Now let's consider the broader context. How does culture shape our experience of death anxiety? You mentioned this earlier.
Culture plays an incredibly significant role. It's huge. Different cultures have vastly different ways of understanding death, framing it, ritualizing it, and this fundamentally shapes both the subjective experience of death anxiety and how individuals respond to assessment tools like the DASS, which, as we noted, has that Western cultural bias.
Can you give some examples of those different cultural views?
Sure. For instance, many Eastern and South Asian cultures, influenced perhaps by Hinduism or Buddhism, often view death not as an absolute end, but as an integral part of a continuous cycle of life, death, and rebirth through concepts like reincarnation or merging back into a larger cosmic
A
process.
cyclical view versus a linear one.
Exactly. In contrast, Western cultures, often heavily influenced by Judeo-Christian beliefs, tend to view death more as a final transition, often into a distinct afterlife, with ideas of judgment, heaven, hell, a more linear path with a definitive endpoint to earthly life.
So the very framework we have for understanding death itself profoundly influences how we feel about it ending. It dictates the narrative.
Absolutely. Because cultural beliefs have such a powerful impact on our perception of death, death anxiety can manifest in very different ways depending on someone's cultural and religious background. Maybe it's fear of judgment in one culture, fear of annihilation in another, fear of leaving community in a third.
Which really underscores the need for culturally sensitive approaches when we're trying to understand, measure, and maybe help people manage death anxiety.
Couldn't agree more. It's vital.
And what do our sources tell us about the relationship between religiosity, being religious, and death anxiety across different cultures? It sounds complicated.
It is complicated, and the findings are quite nuanced, sometimes even seemingly contradictory. For instance, a 2012 study looked at Christian and Muslim college students from various countries. It found that within those groups, higher religiosity actually correlated with an increased fear of death.
Increased. That seems counterintuitive to the idea that religion provides comfort.
It does, doesn't it? Perhaps fear of judgment or the weight of religious obligation plays a role there? However, contrast that with a 2017 review mainly conducted in the US. It suggested more of a U-shaped relationship,
U-shaped.
meaning both individuals who were very religious and those who were not religious at all tended to report lower levels of death anxiety. The highest levels were sometimes found in those who were maybe moderately religious or uncertain. This review also noted a general decrease in death anxiety in older age, regardless of religiosity.
Okay, so very devout and not at all devout might have less anxiety than those in the middle.
That's what that review suggested. Then a 2019 study delved deeper, exploring the role of belief in supernatural agency, a higher power. It suggested that if people believe in a higher power that they perceive as ultimately uncontrollable, that lack of control over existential outcomes might actually trigger greater death or existential anxiety.
So belief isn't enough. The nature of that belief matters. Control, benevolence.
Exactly. And just one more example. A study among Hindu pilgrims in India found that a strong personal belief in reincarnation and a strong sense of meaning in life were linked to reduced death anxiety in older adults. Interestingly, specific religious practices didn't show the same significant effect in that study. It was more about the underlying belief and sense of meaning.
So it's clearly not as simple as more religion equals less fear. It's much more about the specific beliefs, the sense of control or meaning individuals derive, and maybe how integrated those beliefs are.
Precisely. It's very complex.
That leads us quite naturally into terror management theory. Ernest Becker's ideas really connect death anxiety in our cultural worldviews, don't they?
They do indeed. Terror management theory, or TMT, which builds heavily on Becker's work, posits that death anxiety is the most fundamental and profound human concern. So intense, in fact, that it underlies many of our everyday fears and phobias, even ones that seem unrelated.
So it's the engine driving other fears.
That's the core idea of TMT. According to Becker and TMT proponents, much of our behavior, our motivations, our cultural constructions are driven by an unconscious attempt to deny death and keep this underlying terror, this anxiety, at bay.
How do we do that, according to the theory?
When we become more aware of our own mortality, maybe through a news report, a personal loss, even just seeing a funeral home, TMT, suggests we instinctively cling more strongly to our cultural worldviews, our beliefs, values, traditions, and strive to bolster our sense of self-esteem.
Why those two things, worldview and self-esteem?
Because, according to TMT, these provide a psychological buffer against existential anxiety. Our cultural worldview gives us a sense of order, meaning, and permanence in a potentially chaotic universe. And our self-esteem makes us feel like we are valuable contributors to that meaningful world, worthy of significance. Together, they help us feel that our lives matter, even in the face of inevitable death.
But this clinging to worldview can also have a less positive side,
Right.
like prejudice.
Absolutely. This heightened adherence to our own cultural worldview, especially when mortality is salient, can sometimes lead to less tolerant attitudes, even hostility towards those with different beliefs or values, because they challenge our anxiety buffering system.
Okay.
It can also contribute to various maladaptive behaviors and has even been linked, theoretically and empirically, to other mental health conditions like panic disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder behaviors aimed at maintaining control or order in the face of existential dread.
And how does TMT specifically relate to religion?
In the context of religion, TMT proposes a couple of key ideas. First, that fear, particularly death anxiety, can be a powerful motivator for religious belief. Second, that religious belief can, in turn, help to mitigate that fear.
How does religion mitigate the fear, according to TMT?
Becker theorized that to cope with existential anxiety, we pursue either what he called literal immortality, the promise of an afterlife, resurrection, spiritual continuation, often offered by religions, or symbolic immortality.
Symbolic immortality.
Things like leaving a legacy through our work, our children, our contributions to society, being remembered after we're gone, feeling part of something larger and more enduring than our individual physical selves. Religion often offers pathways to both literal and symbolic immortality.
And what does TMT suggest about the different levels of religiosity and death anxiety? Does it align with that U-shape we talked about?
Often, yes. TMT research frequently suggests a similar nonlinear relationship. Individuals who are either very low in their religious commitment, perhaps having alternative secular sources of meaning and value, or very high, fully embracing the literal and symbolic immortality offered by their faith, tend to experience lower levels of death anxiety.
And the middle ground.
Those with a more moderate, perhaps less certain or less integrated level of religiosity might actually report higher levels of death anxiety, maybe because their belief system isn't providing a strong enough buffer against the existential threat.
What drives people towards religion in this view?
One of the key drivers, according to TMT, is existential death anxiety specifically, the fear of complete cessation of annihilation after death. The terror of simply ceasing to be can be a significant motivator towards embracing religious beliefs that offer an alternative, a continuation.
Any evidence for this?
Well, a 2016 meta-analysis provided some support, showing lower death anxiety on average in those who actively practice their religion compared to those who just nominally identified with one. Active engagement seemed key.
Okay.
However, it's not always straightforward. A 2009 study yielded some unexpected findings. While Christians reported lower death anxiety than non-religious individuals, which aligns with TMT's predictions, Muslims in that particular study actually scored higher on death anxiety measures.
Higher. Why might that be?
The researchers noted the Muslim sample size was relatively small, so caution is needed. But it might suggest that the specific content of afterlife beliefs, for example, emphasis on judgment, or cultural factors, interact with TMT processes in complex ways. It highlights the need for much more research across different religious traditions and cultural contexts.
Absolutely. It's quite clear that our belief systems, whether they're religious or secular, play a really significant role in how we navigate the concept of death. Now, what about the idea of actually accepting death? How does that relate to death anxiety? Can you just accept it?
It's a goal for many, and research has consistently shown that accepting one's own mortality, seeing it as a natural part of life rather than something to be fought against constantly, can have positive effects on overall psychological well-being and reduce feelings of distress.
Is there a direct link? Less acceptance, more anxiety.
Pretty much. An older study from 1974 found a low but significant negative correlation between death acceptance and death anxiety. Meaning, generally, the more someone accepted death as a part of life, the less anxious they tended to be about it.
So acceptance can lead to a more positive perspective.
It seems so. It might involve viewing death as a natural transition, part of a larger cycle, rather than just a terrifying and absolute end. Interestingly, sometimes exposure can play a role.
Exposure.
Yeah, being exposed to individuals who are near the end of their lives, or working in fields like hospice care, or even just having experienced significant personal loss can sometimes lead to a shift in one's own thinking about death, fostering greater acceptance over time.
Facing it makes it less abstract, perhaps.
Possibly. And there was a longitudinal study following people over time with cancer patients. It found that higher levels of death acceptance at the beginning of the study were a significant predictor of lower levels of death anxiety later on. Acceptance seemed to buffer against rising anxiety as the illness progressed.
That makes sense. Confronting it directly, in a way, might reduce its power over us. Now, we've talked about the general population, but death anxiety is likely a particularly pressing issue for individuals facing a life-threatening illness like cancer. You mentioned this study just now.
Absolutely. Death anxiety is a very common, often central experience for many cancer patients. It frequently goes hand in hand with feelings of depression, a sense of loss of meaning and purpose, helplessness, hopelessness, and even sometimes a feeling of failure.
Failure.
Yeah, like their body has failed them or they've somehow failed at staying healthy. It's a complex emotional response. It's a significant concern, especially for those in the end of life stages. Higher levels of death anxiety have been clearly linked to a lower overall quality of life for these patients.
How does it affect quality of life?
It can increase the burden of physical symptoms.
Mhm.
Anxiety can make pain feel worse, for instance, and lead to a greater need for palliative care interventions to manage both physical and psychological distress.
And it's not just about the fear of the physical act of dying itself, is it, for cancer patients?
No, it's much broader than that. Their attitudes towards both life and death significantly impact how they experience death anxiety. For instance, research shows that a strong sense of spiritual well-being, finding peace or connection, can be really helpful in reducing this anxiety.
What are the main themes that come up for them?
Research looking into how cancer patients perceive life and death identified 5 key themes. First, a sense of despair, often linked to the fear of dying itself. Second, the process of trying to make sense of death, maybe seeing it as a form of liberation from suffering, or trying to find some control over the process.
Okay.
Third, reflections on how to live the remainder of their lives meaningfully. Fourth, the presence of special feelings and connections with loved ones, often intensified. And fifth, the experience of fluctuation, having contradictory emotions, good days and bad days, hope and despair existing side by side.
That sounds incredibly challenging.
It is. And dignity is also an incredibly important concern for end-of-life cancer patients. Many express significant worries about becoming a burden on their families, physically or financially.
How do they define a dignified death?
Often, they define it not just as being free from pain, but as one in which they can still feel like they're giving something of value to others, sharing wisdom, expressing love, maintaining important roles as much as possible. That sense of contribution remains vital.
It really highlights the fundamental human need for meaning, connection, and value, even, maybe especially, at the very end of life. Now let's consider the relationship between death anxiety and broader mental health. Is it linked to other conditions?
Yes, definitely. Death anxiety isn't just a response to specific life events like illness. It's also been linked to the severity of various mental health issues. It seems to act as a kind of transdiagnostic factor.
Transdiagnostic, meaning it cuts across different diagnoses.
Exactly. It can be found playing a role in conditions like obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, depression, panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder. It might be an underlying vulnerability or an exacerbating factor.
How does it connect to anxiety disorder specifically?
Well, the concept of mortality salience we discussed with TMT, the awareness of our inevitable death, seems relevant here. Reminders of death have been shown in studies to generally increase anxiety levels, particularly for people already prone to anxiety.
And panic disorder, you mentioned that.
Yes, individuals who experience panic disorder often exhibit higher levels of death anxiety. A panic attack itself can feel terrifyingly like dying. The physical symptoms mimic a heart attack or suffocation sometimes, so that intense fear of death can become strongly associated with the panic itself.
That makes sense, a terrifying feedback loop. What about something like suicidality? The relationship must be complex there.
It is complex and perhaps somewhat paradoxical. Interestingly, some research suggests individuals experiencing high levels of death anxiety might, paradoxically, engage in suicidal behavior, perhaps as an attempt to escape unbearable psychological pain that feels worse than death.
But doesn't fear of death usually prevent suicide?
Often, yes. And this is the paradox. Other research indicates that when death anxiety is extremely high, it has actually been linked to a lower intent to die by suicide. The intense fear might act as a deterrent in those cases.
Wow. So it can go either way, depending on the intensity and other factors.
It seems so. It really underscores the intricate ways our fear of death interacts with other psychological states, like depression, hopelessness, and pain tolerance. These findings also really highlight the importance of specialized fields like psycho-oncology, which integrate psychological care into cancer treatment to provide comprehensive support that addresses both the emotional distress and the underlying death anxiety.
And it's not just the patients themselves who grapple with this anxiety, is it? We touched on this, but caregivers also face significant emotional burdens.
That's a really crucial point to consider, especially as our population ages. With the increasing prevalence of chronic illnesses and a growing preference for care provided in the home setting whenever possible, many individuals rely heavily on caregivers.
Often family members, right?
Very often, informal caregivers, spouses, adult children, close friends. These caregivers share a very intimate space with the person they're caring for, often witnessing their pain, their functional decline, their suffering, day in and day out.
That must take a huge toll.
Immense. The financial strains, the physical demands, and the sheer emotional weight placed on caregivers can be enormous. This can certainly exacerbate their own fears and anxieties surrounding death and dying, especially as they face the potential or inevitable loss of a loved one they are so closely connected to.
Do caregivers experience more death anxiety?
Research suggests they often experience high rates of depression and anxiety in general, and death anxiety is frequently part of that picture. However, the research also consistently shows that the presence of strong social support, having friends, family, or support groups to lean on, can play a really significant role in alleviating their death anxiety and buffering against burnout.
The importance of that supportive network really can't be overstated for both the patient and the caregiver. Now, we can't really have a discussion about anxiety in recent years without touching on the COVID-19 pandemic. That must have thrown fuel on the fire for death anxiety globally.
Oh, absolutely. The pandemic, with its staggering tragic toll of millions of deaths worldwide, undoubtedly acted as a major psychological stressor on a global scale. It significantly amplified pre-existing death anxiety for many, many individuals.
How did it manifest?
Studies have shown that COVID-19-related death anxiety influenced people's judgments, their behaviors, like adherence to public health measures or sometimes panic buying, and their overall sense of well-being.
Any specific examples?
Well, an Australian study, for example, found a clear and significant link between the fear of contracting or dying from COVID-19 and higher levels of reported death anxiety. This fear was also linked to a general increase in other psychological disturbances like depression, anxiety, and stress symptoms.
Was the fear proportional to the actual risk?
Interestingly, in that study and others, people's fear of dying from COVID-19 was often disproportionately higher than the actual fatality rate at the time, particularly among younger individuals who were generally at lower statistical risk. The perceived threat was huge.
And older people?
Elderly individuals who may have already been more attuned to their own mortality due to age or health conditions often found their pre-existing death anxiety significantly heightened during the pandemic, compounded by fears of isolation and accessing care.
So it affected everyone, but maybe differently.
Right. The fear of dying from COVID-19 emerged as a leading factor contributing to psychological distress across various countries. It particularly seemed to affect women and those with lower levels of educational attainment more severely in some studies.
And healthcare workers.
Frontline professionals. Yes, even helping professionals, nurses, doctors, social workers, therapists experienced a decline in their own mental well-being during that intense period, partly attributed to increased levels of death anxiety from constant exposure to sickness, death, and the fear surrounding the virus. It was truly a collective confrontation with mortality on an unprecedented modern scale.
It really was. Now, for those who find themselves struggling with significant death anxiety, whether from COVID or other causes, what kind of treatments and approaches are available?
Fortunately, there are several therapeutic approaches that can be helpful, and good therapists will consider both the psychological and, crucially, the cultural dimensions of death anxiety.
Like what?
Well, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, can be very effective. It helps individuals identify and challenge irrational fears or unhelpful thought patterns about death and reduce avoidance behaviors, allowing them to reframe their thinking and ultimately lessen their anxiety.
Okay, challenging the thoughts.
Then there are meaning-centered therapies. These focus specifically on helping people identify and cultivate a sense of purpose, value, and meaning in their lives, addressing those deeper existential fears we talked about by strengthening their sense of why life is worth living.
Finding meaning as a buffer.
Exactly. Mindfulness-based approaches are also used. These aim to foster a greater sense of acceptance of mortality, not by dwelling on death, but by encouraging a focus on the present moment, accepting thoughts and feelings without judgment, and reducing that tendency to get lost in future anxieties.
Being present.
Right. And depending on an individual's personal beliefs and values, existential and spiritual approaches can provide comfort and support. These might involve exploring their views on death, dying, the possibility of an afterlife, or finding connection to something larger than themselves.
And for individuals who are facing a terminal illness, like the cancer patients we discussed, are there specific therapies?
Yes, in the context of advanced cancer, where death anxiety is often significantly heightened, treatment typically involves a combination of approaches to address both the psychological and existential distress. There are some specific interventions, too.
Such as?
Dignity therapy is one. It helps patients find a sense of purpose and meaning by reflecting on their lives, their accomplishments, their values, and sharing important memories and messages for loved ones. It focuses on reinforcing their sense of self-worth.
That sounds powerful.
It can be. There's also meaning-centered group psychotherapy, which offers a supportive group environment for patients to explore spiritual questions and meaning-seeking together in the face of death.
Peer support.
And Cancer and Living Meaningfully psychotherapy, or CALM, is a more individualized approach that aims to help patients develop a greater sense of control over their experience of dying, addressing practical concerns alongside existential ones, which can, in turn, reduce feelings of distress and helplessness.
So various tools available?
Definitely. But again, it's absolutely crucial to remember that a patient's cultural background should always be carefully considered when developing any treatment plan. Their experience and expression of death anxiety and what constitutes a good death for them may be deeply influenced by their cultural beliefs and practices. Therapy has to be sensitive to that.
That holistic and culturally sensitive approach seems absolutely vital. Now, let's touch on a particularly distressing manifestation of death anxiety, the death row phenomenon. What is that exactly?
This refers to the significant psychological distress, anxiety, and deterioration often experienced by inmates who are awaiting execution on death row.
What causes it?
Several factors contribute. The often prolonged period spent waiting, sometimes years, even decades, under the constant threat of death. The conditions of confinement, which frequently involve extreme isolation and sensory deprivation, very limited social interaction, and of course, the profound psychological impact of the crimes they have committed and the impending execution itself.
What are the effects?
It can lead to a significantly increased risk of suicidal tendencies, wanting to take control of the end, perhaps, and even the development of psychotic delusions or severe depression. Studies have consistently shown that suicide rates among death row inmates are alarmingly higher than those in the general prison population, and obviously much higher than in society as a whole.
Are there legal implications?
Yes, arguments have been made in international law and in some domestic legal challenges, suggesting that the death row phenomenon itself, the prolonged waiting under these harsh conditions, constitutes a form of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, potentially violating fundamental human rights. The length of time, often 10 years or more in places like the U.S., is a key factor in these arguments.
It's a truly harrowing situation to consider. Now, let's shift our focus to another interesting angle. How does our attachment style as adults, how we bond with others, relate to death anxiety?
The relationship between death anxiety and adult attachment is quite complex, but there's definitely a connection that researchers have explored. Adult attachment refers to our emotional bonds with significant others, partners, family, close friends that provide us with a sense of security and comfort.
And attachment theory describes different patterns.
Right.
Secure, anxious, avoidant.
Exactly. And studies suggest that individuals who tend to be more anxious about death are often characterized by less secure attachment styles. They might have an anxious attachment style with a strong fear of abandonment, or an avoidance style with a discomfort with intimacy and a tendency to suppress emotions and rely solely on themselves.
How does that link to death anxiety?
Well, this underlying insecurity can make it more challenging for them to form close, supportive, trusting relationships. This, in turn, can hinder their ability to cope with the thought of death because they may feel a lack of reliable support, comfort, and security from others when facing mortality. They feel more alone with the fear.
And securely attached people.
Conversely, individuals with more secure attachment styles, those who feel comfortable with intimacy, trust others, and feel confident they can rely on support when needed, tend to report lower levels of death anxiety.
Why is that?
Possibly because they feel a greater sense of being supported, connected, and valued in their relationships. This provides a sense of comfort, reassurance, and perhaps even symbolic immortality through connection, which acts as a buffer when facing thoughts of mortality.
Connection as a buffer again.
It seems to be a recurring theme. Interestingly, there's even some evidence suggesting that actively increasing one's social curiosity, that genuine desire to connect with and learn about other people, can potentially reduce death anxiety.
How?
The idea is that fostering connection might serve as a form of symbolic immortality, making us feel part of a larger social fabric that extends beyond our individual lifespan.
So those strong, secure social connections can really act as a buffer against this fundamental anxiety. Finally, let's consider how children experience death anxiety. Does it start young?
It does. Death anxiety isn't just a concern for adults. It typically begins to develop in childhood, with documented instances observed in children as young as 5 years old, sometimes even younger, though their understanding is very different.
How do researchers even measure it in young kids?
They utilize various psychological measures, sometimes observations, parental reports, and even assessments of reaction times to death-related versus neutral stimuli, similar to the Stroop concept, but adapted for children.
Are there specific questionnaires for kids?
Yes, there are specific tools. There's a death anxiety scale for children, DSSC, but more commonly used in research is the Revised Fear Survey Schedule for Children, FSS-CR. This asks children to rate how fearful different stimuli make them feel, things like spiders, storms, dentists, and also items related to death or danger.
What about really young children? Pre-readers.
For them, there's a pictorial version known as the Koala Fear Questionnaire, KFQ, which uses pictures instead of words, suitable for children as young as 4.
What do these studies find? Is death a common fear for kids?
Yes. Studies using these tools have shown that children's fears often cluster into categories like fear of failure, fear of the unknown, social fears, and fears related to death and danger. Across childhood and adolescence, death or danger-related fears are consistently among the most common fears reported.
Does understanding death help or make it worse?
Interestingly, one study found that a more mature and accurate understanding of the biological concept of death, understanding that it's final, universal, and involves the cessation of bodily functions in children between the ages of 4 and 8, actually correlated with the decreased fear of death.
Really? So knowledge reduced the fear?
It seemed to in that study. It suggests that providing clear, honest, age-appropriate education about death, demystifying it perhaps, might actually be a helpful approach in alleviating some of the abstract fears young children have about it. Avoiding the topic might not be the best strategy.
That's really fascinating. Understanding it on a factual level might make it feel less like a big, scary unknown and therefore less terrifying.
Well, we've certainly journeyed through a lot of complex territory in this deep dive into death anxiety.
We have indeed. We've explored the definition and the many different facets of this, well, universal human experience. Everything from the core fear of our own demise to the anxiety surrounding the process of dying, the loss involved, and the uncertainty of what might come after.
And we looked at its various causes and the multitude of factors that can influence it.
Right, including a wide range of psychological theories, Freudian, existential meaning management, TMT, the profound impact of cultural beliefs and religious views, and of course our own unique personal experiences and life circumstances.
And importantly, the diverse ways in which individuals and societies attempt to cope with this fundamental aspect of being human, from denial to acceptance to seeking meaning.
And as we've seen throughout, while the underlying anxiety might be a universal part of the human condition, it manifests in incredibly unique and personal ways for each of us, shaped by so many intersecting factors.
That's a key takeaway.
So, as a final thought for you, the listener, perhaps something to mull over, I'd encourage you to consider this. How does your own personal understanding of life, your own individual search for meaning and purpose, ultimately shape your relationship with the inevitable concept of mortality? Maybe exploring some of the philosophical ideas or therapeutic approaches we've discussed today might offer you further insights into your own experience with this fundamental and often challenging aspect of being.